Now, we didn't make a big to-do whenever we changed centuries from the 1800s to the 1900s, although I think I did make a comment that it was a blessing to be in the modern era. The ASV is the first 20th century translation, the American Standard Version of 1901, that we discussed, but I discussed it as a sister translation of the ERV because they were so closely connected in the actual work. So now is when I want to maybe make an emphasis or a point in the fact that we are changing from the 1800s to the 1900s, although we've already done it with the ASV. And I think that we're at an important enough juncture to pause for a few introductory comments about 20th century translations. Now, these will be comments that will also apply to the American Standard Version, but like I say, since that's so closely connected to the ERV, I think we'll keep it with the 1800s just for our thinking as far as our break here, and put everything else in the 1900s and make comments on the basis of that. So let's go through some things, and these are comments that are characteristics maybe as well of 20th century English translation work. So here's number one. The first thing, as you may well could guess, that no century has seen such an explosion of Bible translations as this one. We've studied a lot in the past, several score translations, but no centuries have seen such an explosion of English Bible translation work, or any language for that matter, as has this modern era, the 20th century. For instance, I have a big, thick bibliography of English Bibles printed in the United States, which is no more than that, just a bibliography. It was published by the American Bible Society in conjunction with the New York City Public Library. And it runs from 1777, it's this book, by the way, it runs from 1777 to 1957. So just about 200 years of every Bible printed in this country or published in this country in English. Now, the interesting statistic is that for this century, it gives 471 Bibles, or there are 471 entries. And that only runs through 1957, remember. That's about half of a century, half of this century. It would be extrapolation, but I guess we could say maybe we have double that, almost 1,000 by the end of this century, of entries that you would find here in a work published. Then I have another catalog, I didn't bring it along with me, but another catalog of English Bibles printed anywhere, not just in America. This is entitled The English Bible in America, and it's nothing but you see page after page of bibliography, every single Bible that's been printed from 1777 to 1957. Then I have another bibliography bigger than this back in my study that runs from 1525 through 1961, so that gives us 4 more years. And since it's talking about English Bibles printed anywhere, then I didn't even take the time to count up the number there. Here in America is enough for me. 471 references here to works that have been done. Now, a lot of those are simply reprints or a revised edition or so forth. So don't take that to mean 471 separate major Bible translations from 1900 to 1957. A lot of those are reprints, 3rd edition, 9th edition, or the pocket edition, or paperback edition, or the Catholic edition, or whatever. So then, of course, you're going to really start reducing the number, and you don't end up anywhere near 471. But even without doing that, that's still an impressive number. Even if we've got many different editions or versions, 471 is rather impressive. So that means we're going to have a lot of work to do with 20th century translations. Second introductory comment. Whenever we were looking at the translations of the 1700s and 1800s, I said they were characterized by 2 things. They were privately done works, for the most part, that were generally paraphrases. Those were just 2 thoughts that I gave you that you need to know because they characterize Bibles done in the 17 and 1800s. Privately done works. In other words, these generally were not Bibles that were sponsored by a committee or sponsored by a king or a queen like the KJV or anything on that order. It was just John Smith or Mike Doe decided to do a Bible, or Benjamin Franklin. We saw that he did one. So you just sit down and do it. You have to find a publisher. If you don't find one, then you come up with the money yourself, and you have to print it at your own expense. And then if you sell enough, then the royalties will pay you back. And then the second thing I said that would characterize them, for the most part, they were paraphrases. That's not something just of the modern era, as we would think. Yeah, a man today is so lazy that all he'll do or read is a paraphrase. Well, how true that statement is, but paraphrases dominated the 17 and 1800s. So I would say concerning the 1900s now, I would give those same two characteristics. Many of the works which have been done are privately done works. That is, they're done by a man. In one case, a woman. But for the most part, a man. When we get to some of our more important ones, our very important ones, most of them, although not all, most of them were done by groups of men, committees. So they are privately done. Yes, it's also true that so many 20th century translations are just that, paraphrases for the 20th century. So that English as it is spoken in the 20th century is found in these Bibles. And then I would add another word, if I could, to the Bibles of the 1900s, and that is idiomatic. Idiomatic paraphrases really dominate the scene when it comes to especially privately done works. So many of the works that have been done privately are paraphrases put in sometimes rather harsh or extreme American colloquialism or idiom. That's what I mean by idiomatic paraphrases. Very much written in the language of the people. And so we've got even, some of the works that go by that title, like William's work is the New Testament in the language of the people. And so many of them are like that, in modern English, or in modern language, or in modern idiom, or in the language of the people, or the basic English, or the common Bible, or the simple English, to make sure that the common man or the simple person can read and understand it. Now let me give you just a couple of examples here. These are versions that we're not going to discuss in our study because they don't really warrant it. One of them I've mentioned before, and that is, just to give you an example of what I mean of idiomatic, that is Clarence Jordan's Cotton Patch Bible. Well, that's the name of it, Clarence Jordan. His Cotton Patch Bible. Let me give you two examples. I've already given you one of these before. His epistle to the Romans. Now you got to understand the idiom, you see. Rome was like the major thing, the important thing, the city of Rome, the Roman Empire. And so it's entitled the epistle to, or the letter to Washington. The letter to Washington. And then he puts a translation, in English idiom of the 20th century. And then if you'll open your Bible to John 4, I've got to read verses 11 and 12 to you from Cotton Patch Bible while you read it in a regular standard accepted translation. Yes, I did mean by that. His is not an accepted translation. Not by this authority anyway. Clarence Jordan, the Cotton Patch Bible. How'd you like to be reading the letter to Washington? It just doesn't fit. This doesn't fit. Now, here we go. Are you with me in John 4, verses 11 and 12? Now, this is about the woman at the well. And Jesus and this woman, they're discussing, who's going to do what or how's he going to get water. Well, now here's what she says. Now, this is his Bible. Mister, that well is deep, and you don't have a bucket. So where are you going to get running water? Do you have it over old Grandpa Jake, who dug the well? See, in case you don't understand, who Jacob and who all the patriarchs are, you got it over old Grandpa Jake, who dug the well? The whole Bible is like this, New Testament anyway. The whole New Testament's like this. Everything is put in extreme, harsh idiom and colloquialism, which most people would be opposed to. But I'll tell you what, there are a whole group of ignorant, naive church members out there who just eat a Bible like this up. Think, yeah, because my grandpa, his name was Jake too, so I can really identify with this. I don't have no Jacob for my grandfather. I can identify with Jake, and look at this. Even spell the word going with G-O-N-N-A. You gonna get running water. My. And then here's another extreme idiom Bible that's called Letters to Street Christians. Letters to Street Christians. Now, of course, what he's done, by the way, this was done by two brothers, and you could probably guess the place they're from Berkeley, California. Seedbed for all that student revolt, counterculture movement, activism, and the ingenious ideas of the Flower Children, by two brothers from Berkeley. Now, of course, if they're brothers, you don't take that literally, blood brothers. They're like, I guess you could say two cats or two dudes, two brothers from Berkeley. It just happens that it's two brothers from Berkeley here, though. And they've taken the New Testament epistles, and I know epistle is kind of a churchy term, and if you want to call them letters, that's fine. That's really what they are. We think of epistles as some type of formal document. Really, they were letters, but they've taken them and then rendered them in a form that would be palatable for street Christians or street people. Letters to street Christians. Now, what do we mean here? Hebrews 6:1 is what I have down. Now, do you know what Hebrews 6:1 is about before we get there? What's it about, someone? About laying aside elementary things so you can go on to something more? Okay. Well, now you know that. Well, let's turn over there, though, so you can read as I read. So here's Hebrews 6:1 in Letters to Street Christians by two brothers from Berkeley. There shouldn't be any need to keep running down the same old raps about turning away from the do-it-yourself plan and beginning a new life with Jesus. Can you believe that? Tampering with the Word of God. I think they ought to read the end of their Bible, Revelation 22. Tampering with the Word. There shouldn't be any need to keep running down the same old raps about turning away from the do-it-yourself plan. The works religion, I guess is what they mean. And beginning a new life with Jesus. And there's just a host of Bibles. I've got a few. I've got one to get ahead of myself called Treat Me Cool, Lord. We will study that one since that is a very interesting one by, of all things, a chaplain in the Erie County Jail over in Pennsylvania. We will look at that later. Treat Me Cool, Lord, and some others. They're very interesting paraphrases of the Psalms. By the way, that is a quote from one of the Psalms, if you didn't know it. I think that's Psalm 3, yes. Treat Me Cool, Lord, is a paraphrase of the third Psalm. So here are a couple of really extreme examples, though. Grandpa Jake and the same old rap do-it-yourself Bible, Letters to Street Christians. So we've got then for the 1900s privately done works. Many of them are paraphrases. These are two examples, the Cotton Patch Bible and Letters to Street Christians. You ever heard of those two, or anyone ever come across that back in your counterculture days or something? I think that's how you got converted with two brothers from Berkeley. And these are idiomatic paraphrases. Now let me just add one other thing about the, still under number 2, about the works of the 1900s. And that is, we have had many very important Bibles done. You see, we don't have a lot of important ones from the 17 and 1800s. But a fourth thing I would say, just in a general characterization of 19th century English Bible translation work, is that we have had very important ones to come forth. Some of those you could list, and some of them I'll list here in a moment. Okay, another introductory comment, number 3. The New Testament has fared much better than the Old. That is, we haven't seen the Old pop up as often. Now, I wonder why. Well, that's been true right down through history, with the logic being something like this, and I guess there's a measure of logic to it. If you're going to translate anything at all, start with the New Testament, in case you run out of gas and don't ever get the Old done. That's kind of the logic behind it. And oftentimes people do run out of gas and never do get the Old done. But when you think about that, that may be more according to human reasoning in the long run. I mean, it is important to have the New Testament, but the New Testament's built upon the Old. No, I don't say we should have the Old and leave the New out. I think that we ought to have both. And you find a whole lot of stripped Bibles, half Bibles, one-quarter Bibles is really what they are, because all you have is a publication of the New Testament. Now, I guess to a lot of church people, what I just said would sound rather harsh. They would think, well, the New Testament is where it's at. That's what is so important, the New Testament. So if you're going to do anything, do the New. Well, I'd say if you're going to do anything, do the Word. If you're going to do anything, if you're going to translate, do the whole Bible then. And if you're only proficient in Greek, then hire your uncle who knows Hebrew, and let him do the Old and you can do the New. But we find the New Testament popping up much more often than the Old. Sometimes it's rather rare when you even have an Old Testament. And of course the Jewish people are the only ones who do only the Old Testament. But of course all of your important Bibles, like the Revised Standard Version, will have the complete Word. Well, not the Revised Standard. It has the Old and New Testament, but it doesn't have all of the Bible in it, though. Okay, number four, introductory comments. This should pave the way so you'll know where we're going and what will characterize our study of 20th century translations. There are only a few, I don't hate to even say score, but I guess maybe we could say score. Only a few score more important translations done, and only a handful that may actually be considered true heavyweights. In other words, we've got a lot of wasted, expended energy done on Bible translating work in the 20th century. Only a few score, if we can number them that high, maybe several dozen would be a more accurate estimate, are important works, what we would call important works. See, I don't call Letters to Street Christians an important work, or the Cotton Patch Bible is not an important work. So we've got maybe several score or a few dozen important works. Only a handful of the important ones may be considered the true heavyweights. And the heavyweights are generally, if not always, translations of the entire Bible, not just the New Testament. Also, the heavyweights are generally the work of teams or committees, whereas many of the important ones that don't rank as heavyweights, if you notice what I'm doing, I'm giving us two categories, important ones and heavyweights. The important ones often are just the New Testament, and they're often done single-handedly by one man. So you have to kind of understand this, and then you kind of know where to place Bibles. And if someone told you something about a Bible, told you perhaps its name, and that it was just the New Testament, then you could kind of guess right away. We're probably talking about a very, very idiomatic paraphrase. It was a privately done work, probably done by one man, probably not sponsored by a church or by a committee. See, if you know enough background, you can just be given a couple of tidbits of information about a Bible you've never heard of before, and you can classify that or categorize that right away if you have a feel for the general atmosphere of 20th century Bible translating work. So the heavyweights, we say, are generally the entire Bible. That's not always true, but the vast majority of the time that's true. And they're done by committees. The important ones are often just the New Testament, and they're done by private individuals. Now let me give you just some examples. First of all, of important ones. Now these are ones that I would rank as important translations. Not heavyweights, but important ones. And I'm going to give you more or less the name that they're generally known by, and it's no coincidence that they're known by the name of the author, one man, who did it. First of all, Weymouth's translation. Now, it has another name, but whoever calls Weymouth by its real name, they call it Weymouth. W-Y, then mouth, M-O-U-T-H. Now, I've already told you enough so that you could kind of guess what Weymouth is. Well, it's probably New Testament, and it's done by Weymouth and not Mrs. Weymouth, just by one man, a privately done work, and it's a very idiomatic paraphrase, and you would be right in assuming that. Moffat's, Williams, Phillips, Wuest's, W-U-E-S-T. Now, I just picked those. I could say, many others. We'll be discussing those, so there's no sense in mentioning everything. Or we'd be giving you a bibliography this morning. Weymouth's, Moffat's, Williams, Phillips, Wuest's. Now all of these but one are only New Testaments. One of them, Moffat's, is an entire Bible. But Moffat had other help whenever he tried to do the whole Bible. So we still end up with our same general characterization of it. All of these but one are only New Testaments, and notice that they were all done privately. You can generally tell that by the fact that they're called by the name of the author that did them. Weymouth, Moffat, Williams, Phillips, Wuest, W-U-E-S-T. All right, let's mention some heavyweights. Now, heavyweights are generally known by an abbreviation. Let's see if you know what all these abbreviations stand for. The RSV, what is that? The JB, the NEB, the NASB, the NAB, the NIV. See, most of these go by initials, and the vast majority of them are of the entire Bible, true heavyweights. Some others that don't go by initials, the Amplified, and the Berkeley or the Modern Language. So a lot of these have several different names. Let's see, I think everything that I've given you there, I remember all those that we just reeled off. Yeah, those are all in complete Bibles there. Most of them known by initials. I gave you some of the obvious ones, but you know most of the important ones. The important ones are the obvious ones. Then we have others like, which is just the Old Testament. This would be in a case by itself. The Jewish Publication Society Bible, which is just the Old Testament. You've got the Old and the New edition of that. Jewish Publication Society Bible. And then you've got different editions of some of these we've just mentioned. Like let's stay with the RSV. You've got the RSV, which was done in the New Testament in 1946 and the Complete Bible in 1952. You don't need to get dates down now because we'll cover them specifically later. Then you've got a Catholic RSV, and then you've got several subdivisions of that. You've got Oxford Annotated RSV Reference or Study Type Bibles, and you've got two of those. And then there's another RSV that's slated to come out 2 years from now in 1990. We already know a lot about that Bible because a lot of work has already been done, and that'll be one of the last, very, very end, next fall maybe sometime, one of the last things we study because that's past where we are right now. Will be the 1990 RSV, and all I'll be able to do is talk about it as far as I know it. It's not been published yet, so I haven't seen it, but I've studied some of what it's going to be like because I know who's doing the work and some other things about it. Then you've got let's take the JB, the Jerusalem Bible. You've got the Jerusalem Bible, and then for some reason, I think they've really made a mistake by the name they gave to it because it confuses it with some type of prophecy Bible or something, but you now have the New Jerusalem Bible. I think that was since like 1985 or something. I don't remember the specific date there, but Jerusalem Bible that came out back in the 60s, 1966 I think, and then you've got the New Jerusalem Bible. Now I think some of you who have ordered a Jerusalem Bible recently, I think that's what you got stuck with, was the New JB. So now you don't have the JB anymore, you got the NJB, would be the initials for the Jerusalem Bible. And it has changed quite a bit. And I think that's a very, I don't know who selected that name, but it's a poor selection because I've got other Bibles at home that are nothing but prophecy Bibles. They're like Bibles that just major on prophecy. Maybe they have, I've got some that have just the prophecy portions of Scripture lifted out and put all in one book. And so what do you think of when you say New Jerusalem? But, end time events or prophecy or something. And you study this and it's the New Jerusalem Bible, it has nothing to do with the New Jerusalem of the book of Revelation. The fact of the matter was the Jerusalem Bible was done, translated in Jerusalem. The French edition, which is the original edition, was done in Jerusalem, Israel. That's where it got its name, Jerusalem Bible. And now they've got a new edition of it, so they call it the New Jerusalem Bible. It's very confusing whenever you see that. You think it's some type of book of Revelation type Bible. It has nothing to do with that. Let's see, what else do we have? The New American Bible, another Catholic Bible that came out in 1970, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on all these dates right now because I've studied so much of this, sometimes I forget what Bible came out in what year, but I think that was 1970. And now you have another New American Bible, an NNAB, which came out last year, 1987. So, we've got heavyweights, like the RSV or the Jerusalem Bible, but then we have a Catholic edition of the RSV and now a NJB, a New Jerusalem Bible, and now a double NAB, the New American Bible that caters to a certain group of people. That's another thing we'll discuss at the very end of the class, and that came out last year, 1987. All different types of Bibles. These, of course, aren't all of the important ones or heavyweights, but these are some of the obvious ones that come to mind. All right, a fifth introductory comment. You getting a feel well enough for where we're going? Amen. As we have seen earlier, I think in particular with Connie Berenhausen's The Life and Epistles of Paul, sometimes scholarly translations are found hidden in commentaries. Sometimes the scholarly translations are found hidden in commentary sets. When I say hidden, I don't mean that they were hidden on purpose, but they're hidden from the common churchgoer, or the layman, if I may use that term as it's popularly used today. They're hidden from the layman because you'll never see that on a Bible, on a shelf of Bible translations in your Christian bookstore. You'll see these that I just mentioned, but you won't find a whole commentary set that's 24 volumes that has in it very scholarly, perhaps accurately done translation, because no layperson's going to buy that. So here are some examples that fit here that we will also study. I guess the first one we'll study in a little more detail than the others. The Anchor Bible, I think that was supposed to be done in 38 volumes, but they got about 50 now and they're still not through with it. So I doubt any of you are going to rush out and buy the Anchor Bible, but it's got all the books of the Bible and the Apocrypha translated, and it's not based on the KJV or any. It's a fresh translation by the authors of each commentary volume. Interpreter's commentary, Hendrickson commentary. Hendrickson started whenever he retired from seminary professorship, or maybe that was college professorship in 1953, and worked for 30 years translating the New Testament only. William Hendrickson. And then he died. And all he had done, let's see, were the 4 Gospels and all of Paul's epistles except 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so I think Baker is the one publishing that. Baker had to find someone else to finish Hendrickson's work, which is Hendrickson's work of a translation as well as a commentary. They picked Simon Kistemacher, who is the secretary for the Evangelical Theological Society and chairman of the New Testament department in seminary down in Jackson, Mississippi. But the interesting thing about Hendrickson is that Hendrickson, in the volumes that he did, the Gospels and all of Paul's epistles, with the exception of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, did his own translation. Whenever Kistemacher took over, he's simply following the NIV. So now you've lost, hope of the translation of a new scholarly one on whatever he's done, like Hebrews, James, 1, 2, 3 John, 1 Peter, and Jude, I think, are the only things that are out from his pen thus far. And then we have also the New International Greek Testament commentary. Only 3 volumes in this set are out. You can abbreviate that as it is with the first letter of every word, NIGTC, the New International Greek Testament commentary, where we have thus far Luke, Galatians, and James. Now, these are commentaries based on the Greek text. The commentary or the exegesis is written in English, but you don't derive a whole lot of good from them if you don't read Greek. That's why, although probably Marshall's commentary on Luke in this series is the best available on Luke, I recently discouraged someone from buying that who wanted a commentary on Luke because you have to know a lot of Greek. So I suggested something else from another set for them. It is the best commentary, but there's a whole lot of Greek in there that you'd have to read around or through, and then you lose the meaning. You lose the argument of what he's trying to prove if you can't read Greek. But you'll find also in this the author's own translation from the Greek. So here are very scholarly translations done that you'll never see in your Christian bookstore. They'll never be available to the general public unless you want to buy the commentary set. We're still under number 5. On the other hand, the popularity of some of these major translations, like the Revised Standard Version, can be seen by noting which commentary sets simply adopt them to base their exegesis upon, rather than have the author of each commentary volume do his own translation. In other words, if you're going to write a commentary on Matthew, you've got the choice of taking the NIV and printing that in there and writing your commentary on the basis of that, or taking some other accepted modern-day translation, or doing your own. You have the choice of doing that. Oftentimes, commentary sets simply take an existing translation, the NIV, the KJV, the RSV, and build their commentary on that basis. Now, the author of the commentary always works with the Greek and Hebrew in mind. I don't mean to imply that he doesn't do that. But they simply put that there because it saves time and it's well known, and perhaps that will attract the attention of people who normally would not purchase such commentaries. For instance, the Broadman commentary set, which is a Southern Baptist set, employs the RSV. The more recently done Expositor's Bible commentary set, which is not complete yet, has chosen the NIV. And you'll simply have the NIV text and the author's exegesis of that. And if and when, and they often do, the author disagrees with the translation he's working from, then he's generally free to say so and make the emendations or the corrections in his own exegesis, which you'll often find in Broadman. One of the authors of whatever book disagrees with the RSV reading, or one of the authors of an EBC, an Expositor Bible's commentary set, disagrees with the reading of the NIV. Now, all of these abbreviations and notions and words may sound like a crypto outer space type language, but you'll grow accustomed to it as we work our way through here, and hopefully it'll become more like the back of your hand, these men and their names and the names of these works. Sixthly, this morning, a whole separate study involves these so-called reference or study Bibles. Now, the reason I say it's kind of like a separate study, which we're going to include here in Biblical Lit, is they don't generally give us a new translation. Well, they don't give us a new translation. That would defeat the purpose of having a study Bible. They simply employ one of the better known translations and build a reference or note system on that. So you have to understand what a study Bible or a reference Bible or a note Bible, or they go by different names. We're going to call them SBs, though, study Bibles. That's their best known name, SBs, study Bibles. They don't take a new translation. They don't invent a translation. They don't hire someone to translate or get a committee together to draw up a new translation. They employ one of the better known existing ones and build a reference or note system upon it. For instance, here are just some study Bibles. Scofield. Scofield, for many, many years, was available only in KJV. Now it's available in NIV. Thompson Chain Reference. Many years KJV, now it's NIV. And just some other names. The Master's Study Bible. The Open Bible. The Topical Chain Bible, the Narrated Bible, the Christian Life Bible, Dixon Analytical Study Bible, Dake's Annotated Bible, the Ryrie Study Bible, and you can just go on and on. Ryrie is available in many different things today because Ryrie has become so, his writings have become so popular. So you have to understand that it's going to be like a Ryrie's Bible, but Ryrie didn't do the Bible, he did the notes in it. And then it'll be based on the text of the KJV or the NIV or the NKJV, the new KJV of 1982, or the NASB, or something of that order. Scofield, Thompson Chain, Masters, Open Bible, Topical Chain, Narrated, Dixon, Dakes, Ryrie, Christian Life. NIV Study Bible. Oh, just so many of them here. We'll look at those one by one later. Now, seventhly and finally, for our introductory comments, and looks like we have time to maybe study a few of these works we're talking about, you're asking about now, okay, how many Bibles are we going to look at? Enough of the scare tactics. How many are we really going to look at? Well, that's a good question. But it's also a little discouraging when you hear the answer. Now, this bibliography that I've given you before, it has 471 Bibles. References anyway, up through 1957. If we were to extend that from 57 through 87 or 88, we'd have to add several hundreds more Bibles. So, my estimate, I've already finished all of these notes, but my estimate, because I haven't counted up every single one of them, is somewhere in the order of between 100 and 125. We won't leave any stone unturned that needs to be turned over. You don't need to turn over the stone to Letters to Street Christians. You can leave that where it is. Just let the worms grow underneath it. But any stone we need to turn over, we'll turn over. Now, let me then say a note that's an encouraging note about that statistic, 100 to 125. That doesn't mean we're going to have 100 to 125 messages left. A whole lot of these can be discussed in a sentence or two, or a paragraph or two at most. And B, included in that number are a lot of the study Bibles whose English text we will have already studied before we get to the study Bible. Like any Bible based on the KJV, we're not going to restudy the KJV. We'll just study that study Bible, how it employs the KJV. Or you can do that for any other translation. So that's an encouraging note to end on in these introductory comments. Somewhere over 100, probably less than 125 Bibles to look at. But if you combine all the study Bibles and combine the second, third, and fourth revised editions, and maybe you reduce that down closer to between 50 and 75 actual Bibles. I think 50 is probably the number I end on with major translations, but then we have to do other things after that, and that jumps the number up over 100. But when you reduce it, and you know that, well, I'm studying this study Bible, number 1, and this one, number 2, and then this revised edition, number 3, and all of this is based on the RSV, number 4 numbers, really we're just talking about one, the RSV. But whatever has been based upon that, we'll study that as a separate thing in addition to it. Now, some works that I have studied separate, for instance, Jewish from Protestant from Roman Catholic translations. So you study the Jewish ones first, then the Protestant, then the Catholic, or whatever order. But I've decided for our practice, the way we're going to study them is in chronological order. We're going to study them in chronological order. We're going to start with 1900 and go to 1988, or if we get in the RSV, 1990. Now, of course, there are some pitfalls to that method of study, and I just hope we'll be able to avoid them. It separates the Jewish, the Protestant, the Roman Catholics from those of the same order, and that becomes a little difficult. For instance, one of the important Jewish Bibles of this century was done in 1917, or completed in 1917. Then the next really important Jewish Bible we're going to discuss was completed in the 1980s. Now, the first one comes at the beginning of our study, and the second one toward the very end. So whenever we get to that end one, then I'm going to have to go back and review a little bit, because it's kind of like a revision, or the thought anyway is based upon the 1917 Jewish Bible. I have to go back and review that to make sure that we've got things tied together. The same is true with Roman Catholic Bibles. We'll come across Catholic Bibles rather early on, and then we skip up into the 60s, and then we come into the 70s, and then we have a Catholic Bible done in the early 1970s that then has a revision that's intended for a certain audience in Roman Catholic circles that comes out in the late 1980s. And so I'm going to have those separated, because the audience for which that revised edition of that Roman Catholic Bible came out is an audience also that has been soothed by some Protestant translations. So we're going to have to group those together. So there are going to be some Well, we're going to have to stop this for now. We'll pick it up later again. And I just hope we'll be able to tie those together and connect those as we should. Seems to be something else I was going to say along that line. Let's see. Chronologically separates Catholic, Protestant. I guess I was just going to say some more about the fact of various editions. It's difficult to know sometimes when to study the edition. Do you look at the RSV of 1952 and study all the editions of it, including that one of 1990? I mean, that jumps way ahead chronologically. To keep it all with the RSV? Or do you keep the edition studied at their appropriate date so that the study stays in chronological order? We're not going to be entirely consistent in the way we do that, and I hope I'll show you the reasons why, and they will meet your approval whenever we study that. But for instance, the RSV Bible of 1990 fits in the same category as that revised Roman Catholic Bible I mentioned a moment ago. So we're going to put those in a class by themselves. Oh, another point I was going to say. What about if the New Testament comes out in one year and the Old Testament in another? Well, generally, this won't always be true, but we'll save it until the whole Bible is available. For instance, the RSV. The New Testament came out in 1946. We won't study it until 1952, when the entire Bible comes out, assuming that I stay true with my notes, unless I see some reason to change it and make it better. Now, again, before we get into some actual Bibles here, it'll be impossible for all of you or for any of you to remember all these Bibles and the dates of all of them and so forth. Well, we already know that, so don't be afraid of that matter. I think what we'll be able to do, I know we'll be able to do this, is give you a real thorough understanding of 20th century translation work. You'll know the whole air and atmosphere. And the more important Bibles, because we're going to spend more time on them, I'm sure you'll remember them a lot better. Some of them will pass over rather quickly. When we come to some that are worthwhile obtaining, then I'll make you aware of that. Some are more worthwhile than others. But then again, we could divide the church up into different divisions. Well, it may be more worthwhile for this person, but not someone else in the church. So maybe we'll be able to do that as well. You can see it's going to be kind of complicated, covering 100 or 125 works in a period of 90 years. So, let us begin. Number one, and they'll all be in order. And I don't know if you want to keep up your numbers, but I have in my notes, or whatever you want to do, letter A or whatever. But number one for the first translation, and we'll go right on through 50, and then we'll have to see how we're going to number after we go through 50. Number one, the American Standard Version of 1901. Say we've already discussed that. Well, good. You're up to date so far. That means we won't have to do it this morning then. Well, we've got to list it as our first one of the 20th century. It was an important one. Not important any longer today. It's not used today, but it was an important one then. Well, to give my terminology that I gave earlier, it was a heavyweight, not just an important one. I'm not going to stay with that terminology the whole time, though. The ASV, and it's known by that abbreviation, the ASV of 1901, number one. Okay, number two, the Modern American Bible, 1901. The Modern American Bible, 1901. Now, despite the name, you'd think you get the whole Bible. Only the New Testament was ever published. Would better be known as the Modern American New Testament. It was the work of a Protestant Episcopal Church priest whose name was Frank S. Ballantyne, who lived 1859 through 1936. And here was the origin for this very, very obscure translation. Ballantyne read French, and when he had read the four Gospels in a modern, late 19th century French translation, he wanted to do what had been done there in English, which was a very idiomatic translation. So we're hardly into our study the second translation, and we're already talking about extreme idiom. He based his translation, however, upon the received text, the TR, which would of course mean that his translation is flawed in that regard. Only the New Testament ever came out. Number 3, the letters of Paul to 7 churches and 3 friends, 1901. We'll give you the dates for all of these, the name of it, the authors, and so forth. The author was Arthur S. Way, W-A-Y, 1847 to 1930. If I have these Bibles, I generally will try to remember to bring them along. Like I don't have, well, we've already studied the ASB. I don't have the Modern American Bible. That's a very obscure work. But Way's Bible is still being published today. This is a rather new edition of Arthur S. Way's The Letters of Paul to 7 Churches and 3 Friends. Now, Way was a trained classics scholar who had already translated into English several Roman and Greek classics. So the next thing he decided to do was to render some of the New Testament, which was done in Greek, which he understood, into modern English. Now let's check your New Testament Bible knowledge. Paul wrote letters to 7 churches and 3 friends. Who were those 3 friends? Titus, Philemon, Timothy. Who were the 7 churches? Galatia, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Romans, Thessalonica, Corinthians. I think we're over that by now. A thoroughly revised, we'll come back to that here in a moment, a thoroughly revised second edition appeared in 1906. Now, other of my works say that this came out in 1904. And so here's a note I want to make right off the bat. It's often a problem in researching this with this very old material when the Bible or the second edition or the 9th edition really came out. So most places I see that it came out in 1906, so that's the date I'm going to leave you with. But in case somebody hears a tape and they do study later and they find out that it was really 1904, then I'm leaving room for that, as well as other problem dates whenever we're talking about older material. Now, according to the preface of the work, it included 500 changes from the 1901 work. 500 changes from 1901 to 1906. And the second edition also included the book of Hebrews. Within the first 20 years, Way's translation went through 5 editions. Now, the copy that I have is a reprint. I think this was done in 1981. Hasn't been available for many, many years. It was republished in 1981 by Kriegel Publications in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And the new translation, they've thrown in the book of Psalms. And I think they threw in Psalms. I'm not for sure. I don't think Way did Psalm. They threw it in probably to attract more people to the Bible, to buy it. So you get more for your money instead of just some of the epistles of Paul in the New Testament. As you see, it's a green book here. The Arthur S. Way translation, Letters of Paul, Hebrews, and Book of Psalms. Now, he lists the epistles in what, in his opinion, is the chronological order. And here's what he gives. Thessalonians, we'll count the letters that he has given us here. Thessalonians, number 1. Corinthians, That's first and second, first and second. Number 2, Galatians. 3, Romans. Philippians. Colossians. Ephesians. And then if we don't throw Hebrews in there as being done by Paul, which he does, and of course the book of Psalms, then he's given us our 7 churches. Some of you were duplicating names earlier. And then as far as friends, in between Colossians and Ephesians, he gives us Philemon. And then his letters to friends would conclude with the first letter to Timothy, then Titus, and the second letter to Timothy. Now, if you've got that down, this is a nice and interesting translation. It's not one that I recommend that you purchase, and you'll see why here in a moment. But it is rather nice translation. I don't think there's another on the market of the same order as this. Let me give you 2 things that stand out to me about this translation. And he mentions one of these as number 2 for the object of his work in the preface. And then he mentions the second thing I'm going to mention just later on in the preface. But here are 2 things that this Bible is noted for. And if you would purchase the Bible, you would probably purchase it for one or both of these reasons. Probably the first one, since it's the better known here. I just told you in a recent message that Paul often used an amanuensis whenever he was writing his letters. For instance, if you look in book of Romans, chapter 16, verse 22, a verse that maybe has bothered some lay Christians whenever they've read this, because they come to Romans 16:22 and they say to themselves, but I thought Paul wrote the book of Romans. I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, salute you in the Lord. Well, now, who did write Romans? Well, Tertius wrote Romans. We're just told. Paul just told us who wrote Romans. Tertius. Tertius wrote it, but it came from the mind. I mean, who was the man who had the pen in his hand and the paper before him and he was doing the writing? It was Tertius. It came from the mind of the Apostle Paul. And so because Paul was employing, and you can find this out from other places like, Galatians chapter 6, many various references to this, Galatians 6 and verse 11, so forth. You can find that Paul did use an amanuensis. That just means like a scribe, one who did the writing for him, a secretary, someone that could take down what he was saying. Because he used an amanuensis, the more he was raptured in his thoughts, the less his mouth could keep up with his mind, Paul. And even less the amanuensis could keep up with either of the above, either Paul's mouth or his mind. Well, the result would be sometimes a very disjointed passage that seems not to make just a whole lot of sense, because what we would think should be important in the passage is absent from the passage. Now, have you ever had that experience? You're writing a letter and these thoughts are just flooding your mind and you're getting writer's cramp. You're trying to get it out so quickly. And before you know it, you're 3 thoughts down the page in your mind. Your hand, you're 3 thoughts back. By the time you get that thought down your writing, those 3 thoughts down the page in your mind, you've forgotten what it was now. You've forgotten. Paul, as he got raptured in certain, situations when he was dictating the letter to his amanuensis, like Tertius for the book of Romans, sometimes his mouth can't keep up with his mind, and neither time can the amanuensis keep up with him. And that leaves, as a result, sometimes a very disjointed passage. Now let me read you from, and therefore, Way attempts to help the English reader by supplying fillers. That's the first point I want to give you. Interesting thing about his translation. He supplies fillers in here. Now, of course, any filler is going to involve a huge measure of interpretation, because the text simply doesn't give us what is left out there. By conjecture, we can reason what we think was there, but it's pure reasoning and conjecture. So here's what he has to say about this practice of Paul. For instance, in the preface on page 8, to the mass of readers and hearers who are untrained in theology, who do not consult commentaries, a prominent feature of Paul's style. That's why he only translates Paul's work, his letters to churches and friends. Paul's style is an apparent lack of continuity of thought, sometimes almost amounting to incoherence. The transition from subject to subject, from step to step of an argument is not clear. There seem to be links wanting or missing. The writer appears to pass from one thought to another which has no obvious connection with it. In multitudes of his sentences which begin with the word for, the inference is by no means apparent. He has said something, he says, therefore. Well, we can't even see why he says therefore. How in the world is what you're saying now, this therefore, how is that based on something that you've said earlier? You know, we say, it's going to rain today. Therefore, go to the store now. Well, the point is, go to the store before it rains. But what if you left off that point about it going to rain and you said, therefore, go to the store now? Say, that doesn't make any sense. You got to begin something else in that paragraph before you can say therefore. Sometimes Paul leaves out that first sentence. Now, you might not have noticed that, and the reason why is because you're so familiar with the text, it's become nice little juicy gems to you. And you've never thought through the flow of the entire argument there. I think he even might say something about that either here or later on. In multitudes of his sentences, which begin with the word for, therefore, the inference is by no means apparent. These peculiarities are especially noteworthy in the books of Romans and 1 Corinthians, and he's right there. The consequence is that to many, very many Christians, Paul's epistles, here he goes, are a treasury of precious texts, of inspiring passages. But to comparatively few is he a really connected thinker or a writer whose language is characterized by sharp precision and limpid clearness of expression. You just know all the neat little sayings that he has to say, but why does he say that? Beats me. I don't know. I got it memorized. It sounds good, but why did he say it? What's the connection in the passage? I don't know. This is what this Bible is to do. It's to help you there. Readers and hearers who want to grasp the spirit of Paul's teaching, to follow intelligently his arguments in every detail, to enter into his thoughts and emotions, to appreciate the circumstances and mental attitude of the writer and those first addressed by him, are continually baffled by the lack of assistance afforded by what are practically the only versions generally accessible, like the KJV and the ERV. He said, the Paul that we know from church is not quite Paul the man, with his weaknesses, his impulsiveness, his clinging affection, his clear-headed common sense. His writings are not read as real letters to people. They are epistles, religious and doctrinal treatises, grave, dignified, and somewhat stilted. Split up into chapters and verses. By the way, there are no verses in here. He does have chapters, but no verses. As they are, they scarcely read as organized wholes, as outpourings of intense earnestness, dominated each by its leading thought of which the writer never loses sight. Now, I can sympathize with what Way is saying here, that too many people today read this as a doctrinal treatise and forget this was a passionate letter that Paul sent to people, for instance, in Galatia, who were about to apostatize from the faith. It's a passionate letter of his to them. It's not the book of Galatians. It's become that to us through church history and our study of it. But it's a passionate letter to those people. And you lose something of the meaning if you lose sight of the purpose of the writing. Considerable portions of some of them, Paul's letters, are too often regarded as wastes of somewhat obscure reference to views and practices which have largely lost all interest for us moderns, yet interspersed with oases of exquisite charm and spiritual refreshment. They contain a large number of, quote, verses, unquote, which are, especially when removed from their context, very inspiring, suggestive, and comforting. But they also contain a multitude of admonitions, appeals, and warnings, the connection of which with the circumstances of the writer's life is but vaguely perceived, and which seem to be empty of interest and instruction for us. And did you follow all of that? That's very good. He's exactly right in what he has to say. But then, this is nothing but a commentary whenever you add in what you think Paul said or thought but never got onto paper then. We can take comfort in this, that whatever got onto paper was the will of God and what didn't wasn't. That's for sure. Some books of the Bible have been lost, as we studied earlier in Biblical Lit. But he calls this not a paraphrase. He said, I don't like that term paraphrase. He said, this is truly a Bible. Well, it is a Bible, but it's a commentary in a Bible also. And you have to know that whenever you read a work like this. So if you'll turn to 1 Corinthians 9. Let me see if I can find, he gives it up here in the preface somewhere. Well, I'll have to just turn to it. 1 Corinthians 9. Let me show you how he starts this off. Now, he wants to let you know what the background is of 1 Corinthians 9. So here's what we have. Now, see if you find this in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 9. I have to meet two protests. Number one is the protest of your intellect, which objects to curtailment of its rights. And number two, the protest of your appetite, which objects to curtailment of pleasures not sinful. My answer to the first is my own example. Am not I emancipated from the Mosaic law? Am not I a true apostle? Have I not with my own eyes seen Jesus our Lord? About now you should be picking up with, well, finally we got into 1 Corinthians 9. Well, what was all that beginning? Explaining why he's going to say what he has to say in this 9th chapter. Why does he just start off all of a sudden defending himself? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen our Lord Jesus Christ? Why does he do that? There must be a reason why he's defending himself. You see what I'm saying? And you never catch that. When you're reading along, you just start into chapter 9. After you finish chapter 8, Paul starts defending himself as though somebody's opposed to Paul. I wonder what got Paul all rankled here in chapter 9. Starts off defending himself. Don't I have the right, like the other apostles, to lead about a wife? In other words, to be married? Don't I have the right to be paid for my services of ministry? Question after question. Don't I have the right to do this? Don't I have the right to do that? But you're never told why he starts defending himself. So Wade throws in what in his suggestion is the basis for that.